1:30, so we'll get started.
Test.
All right, so if you would like to move forward closer, you know, there's a lot of seats up here in the front. Teachers hate it when you're way in the back. Just kidding. Anyway, welcome. You are at the Wide World of Speculative Fiction panel. And I'm Tabitha Lord, I'm the moderator. I'm also the Vice President of the Association of Rhode Island Authors. So welcome and thanks for coming today. I write a lot of speculative fiction. I also write under a pen name, or romantic suspense under a pen name, but my sci-fi series is finished and complete. You want to stop by my table and see it. I write a lot of short fiction that I published into several speculative markets. I'm formerly the managing editor for the Ink It Writers blog. I just left that position less than a year ago to focus more on my own stuff. And what else can I tell you? I'm a former teacher. I have 4 kids. They all live on the West Coast now. My husband and I are leaving on the 28th of December, moving into our RV and traveling across the country for a couple of years and having an adventure. So this is probably my last event here in Rhode Island, so yay, but also sad. Anyway, I'm going to let my illustrious panel members introduce themselves briefly, and then I'm going to pitch them a couple of questions to get the conversation going. And then I'd love to open it up to the audience and hear what you want to talk about. And anything to do with writing craft, writing habits, anything you want to ask us is fair game. You know, we like to try to keep it around the speculative genres, but if you have something else about writing craft, we're happy to answer. Just please, when you do ask your question, make it a generic question that everyone can benefit from the answer, not specifically about your manuscript. If you want to talk about that, come find us at our tables later and we can chit-chat with you more later, but you know, keep the questions, 1 question per person, make it brief, and make it something that we all can benefit from, if you don't mind. Okay? So, take it away, Paul.
Hi, my name is Paul Magnan. Is my thing working? I guess so. Well, my voice
Really
is loud enough.
close. It works.
All right. And I have a 4-novel series that's a dark fantasy. It's about a land that's literally surrounded by hell. And I have a short story collection here. And some of it was previously published, and some is for the book itself, varying from the straight and narrow. And I've written several short stories, many tens of short stories over the years. And this is a complete series here. And if you're interested, come see me. And now.
Hi, Christine Lajewski. I've spent 35 years teaching alternative high school, little middle school. I think almost all my character development comes from being around young people. I work at Mass Audubon as a teacher naturalist, part-time, and I'm also a haunt actor. If you visited Spooky World when it was in Foxborough at the Bayside Expo, I was there. Trails to Terror in Wakefield, Rhode Island, I was there. Currently at Barrett's Haunted Mansion in Abington, Mass. And a lot of my story ideas come from there. It's been lots of fun. So if you wander by my table, I've got 3 books of my own that I've written. Bone Belly, a novel. The Auteur, down to my last copy on that one. My short story collection, Erring on the Side of Calamity. And then 2 of the anthologies I'm in that are available for purchase today. Wicked Women, and a charity anthology that is a tribute to Anne Rice. All the proceeds from Dancing in the Shadows goes to Anne's favorite charity, which was Animal Rescue of New Orleans.
All right, so we'll kick it off with just a general, our take on what genres fall under the speculative fiction umbrella. And I'm going to just spurt them out. Which ones are speculative fiction? Science fiction is speculative fiction, right? What else?
Science fiction, urban fantasy, steampunk. Speculative fiction encompasses a wide area. It touches any genre, really, that you take something maybe that's ordinary and throw something very extraordinary in there. And my dark fantasy is definitely one of straight, sometimes even straight fantasy. And it's a pretty big umbrella. It encompasses a lot of genres. So.
It's one of those things that authors like to argue about too, and lit professors and things like that. Like, if speculative is you're asking the question, what if? But that all fiction does that. So obviously that's not all speculative. There are, and not everything you write in a particular genre would qualify speculative. For example, I do mostly horror, and I do some I'm starting to do more and more that is dark fantasy, kind of my take on some fairy tales. But if I wrote about a serial killer, that's something that actually does happen. I wouldn't consider that speculative, and other writers would not. But if I do my take on a particular fairy tale or folk tale, and Bone Belly is an example of something that it takes place in this world. It takes place in a haunted attraction, but it also has a condemned soul. He's been transformed into some kind of strange creature, and demons are spirits that are actually caseworkers to some of these souls, these condemned souls. And they create within our world their own private hells. That's highly speculative, even though it's taking place in this world, and it's happening right now as we speak. It's kind of my explanation for Bigfoot sightings, actually.
So that building off of that, what is it about our fiction that turns it into speculative? Talk more about that. It's that otherness, but let's talk in our own genres. Like, so if you're writing I'm writing the difference between writing, a book that's got science in it and is fiction, and a science fiction novel. To me, it's like you've got that element that doesn't exist yet, or that you're projecting forward, right? But what else? Talk more about what makes something speculative, and how do we feel it in the book?
Okay, well, in my short story collection, I have a story called Hatchlings, and it's set in a contemporary setting, but there are fairy folk there, and they're taken for granted, but the thing of it is, it's not storybook fairy folk, it's not mystical, weaving in and out of the mist fairy folk. It actually gets pretty ugly in spots, because the combination of humanity and the fairy folk it's not always smooth. And so that would be an example of speculative. What would happen if we lived in that kind of a world? And in my series, this one here, it's the world is pretty much like the one we live in now. There are some technological things. They have firearms, they have the internal combustion engine. It's very similar to the world we live in now, but that area happens to be surrounded by what I call the Tizian curtain, which is basically hell. Within it are infernals that are coming closer, but the people in this land are too busy arguing and fighting one another to pay attention to what's on the outside. And it's up to the main character to say, hey, let's put that aside, because something more important to worry about is coming right at us. So, again, what if we lived in a world like that? Would we still argue and fight amongst ourselves? We probably would. Just like we do now. Even if we had hell literally all around us creeping in, we wouldn't be paying attention to that. We'd be paying attention to our own little petty issues. So that's how I use speculative fiction in there.
For me, I think it is stepping outside. It's the realm of possibility, but it's fantastical possibility. So you probably need to suspend disbelief if it's speculative. At least the stuff I write. I'll give you some examples. There is in Erring on the Side of Calamity. There's one story called Mercy Brown and Me. It's about the famous Exeter vampire who's not a vampire, if you're familiar with the story, and a 14-year-old girl who claims that Mercy Brown is her best friend. So it's a girl who lives present day. Mercy Brown died in the early 1890s or 1880s of tuberculosis, but she was treated as though she was a vampire, her heart taken out and burned. You can visit her grave. It's really interesting when people leave there. But this is a girl who says, I am friends with Mercy Brown. Okay, psychological, a real haunting. I don't think that's speculative, though, because it's wholly, having worked in alternative high school, I've had students who've made a lot of claims, like, maybe not like that, but, what they believe in, what they think is actually happening to them. It could be delusional, it could be real. But I don't call that speculative. The one that would be speculative would be, Bone Belly, definitely. The story I have in the anthology Wicked Women, it's called Child of Reason, takes place in New England around the time of the Salem witch hysteria. And it's a boy who lives isolated with his mother in the woods. It is clear that she is some kind of supernatural being. It becomes clear to him that his father is some kind of supernatural being. And he has a legacy, and he has talents that are inborn. And unfortunately, he loses both parents very early in his life. He becomes dependent on himself. And as he tries to understand and learn what these talents are that he has, the body count kind of just keeps rising in the story, which I'm not expanding into now. That's highly speculative, I would say.
Okay, so we have a few topics we've touched on. I want to ask if anybody has questions or anything any direction you want to take the conversation. Otherwise, I have a list I can keep going. But usually when I say this, the hands go up. So let's start here. Yes, please.
So take a look at Stephen King's book, The Dead Zone, which talks about the abilities, psychic abilities after an accident.
Right.
But those psychic abilities are rare, but they happen. Would that fall into speculative fiction, or would that just be something else?
I think it's speculative,
Yeah.
personally, because I think that you can say that, oh, that does happen, but a scientist would probably say, no, really, there's an explanation for, what's happening or not. And I think that when you get into that true, I still think it's speculative. We could disagree that actually happens in the real world, right?
Yeah, sure.
So if you're proposing that somebody comes back from an accident or from returns from the dead and suddenly has abilities that they didn't have before, I think that's taking it in a speculative direction, personally. Do you guys agree?
I think, I mentioned that I don't think all horror would fall under the speculative umbrella. I think that one could. I read The Dead Zone, and
it was a long time ago. That's why
it was a while ago. But the thing about psychic abilities is that, and I'm speaking now as someone who became a shaman. Okay, so when you do the shamanic journey, the kind of things that the main character sees in that book, in that story, are vivid. And there's no doubt about what he's seen. It's not symbolic. That's very speculative. That doesn't actually happen that way. And anybody who claims to be psychic, who's being honest, will tell you it doesn't happen that way. It's not like suddenly you're, in movies they especially do this. It's like you're surrounded with these movie-like images. It doesn't happen that way. Very, very speculative now. So. While I wouldn't call all horror speculative, I think a lot of it is. That would be one.
And there was somebody back here, and then I'll come up to the front. Yeah, you had their hand up over here. No? Okay, go.
I was just wondering, looking at the examples that you mentioned, there was a TV series a few years back, Grimm. Is that kind of one of the speculative fiction?
That was a fairy tale based one, right?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah,
I think so.
It's like they were modern people, but they were actually the different monsters hiding among us.
Well, if there were monsters hiding among us and they weren't serial killers, then I would say probably that's got that speculative element to it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we all kind of agree that some people will claim they have seen real, honest-to-God monsters. We call them delusional, if they say that. and we probably can make a really good case they're delusional when they say that. In the series Grimm, there wasn't delusional at all. So yes, very speculative. It's high fantasy in our present day world.
Yeah, it was very, I remember that series as well. It was a good series. And yes, it was very obvious and upfront that there were shapeshifters there. And I haven't personally met any shapeshifters. I don't know if anyone here has. But I haven't met any that I'm aware of. So I would definitely call that speculative.
That's what we got out here. Yes, I thought you had your hand up before.
When researching, especially for like speculative fiction, you fall down like that rabbit hole of like how to forge a sword or like what kind of trees grow in Norway.
Oh, hell yeah.
Do you guys have like go to like what you like to use for resources? Is it just like Wikipedia all the way? Like,
well, I think it does. So I was actually talking with somebody about this earlier about when you're writing in a speculative realm, but yet you're touching on things that people recognize, right? So my sort of how I approach that is if I'm using something like, for example, in this book, one of the main characters is a healer, but she's a telepathicist who can. I always wished I could do this when I was a paramedic, like put your hands on somebody and be like, it's a heart attack, not a stroke, and know what it was. So I gave her that ability, and she also can use her telepathic powers to actually affect change. Now it's on human bodies. So I made sure when she was doing the healing, if it was a particular tension pneumothorax, I know what that is, I know how you fix that in the field. So I made sure that the science behind what she was doing was accurate. So anything that, when I'm trying to craft a story that has those elements, if you're gonna recognize it, I do my homework, and I certainly fall down the rabbit hole of doing my homework. Like I had dogfights in one of those scenes, and I'm like, oh, I got stuck up in the simulators of doing, World War II dogfights, and I'm like, there's spaceships that are doing the dogfights, but people know that term. They know, they're familiar with that in the modern world. So when I bring that into a speculative side, I need to do my homework on the parts that are going to feel familiar. Then, if I'm making something up, right, I'm giving somebody magic or powers or a tech that doesn't exist yet, I make up the rules, and then I have to be really consistent with following them throughout, or else people notice right away that you gave that sort of power it didn't have there, right? And you need to watch for that, because your readers will find that quickly, and they'll call you out on that. So, and as a reader, I don't like that. If I think someone's using, they imbue something with a power to solve a plot problem. No. But the rabbit hole is so much fun, and it's also so time-consuming. And it's not the only way you can get information, though. Like if you're trying to research real things, museums. I once was writing a horror short story, and then I'll let these guys talk for a minute. But and I got it was one of the first times I actually got invited to participate in an anthology. They said, oh, we would like you to participate. Here's the paycheck. Here's the due date. Here's the topic. And I was like, yay. And I was like, I don't write horror. What am I doing? And it was going to be a ghost story. And I'm like, oh my God, I've never done this before. How am I going to do this? And I actually went to a place in, it's called Strawberry Banks in Connecticut, New Hampshire. And it's like sort of like Plymouth, where everybody's dressed up in the period that they have preserved. It's like a museum, but a walking tour of this preserved place. And I'm walking up the teeny tiny staircases, and the fire's burning in the hearth, and I'm smelling it, and I'm like, and I suddenly got inspired with exactly how I was going to write this period piece with ghosts. So, there's more than one way to get sucked in a rabbit hole. I spent the whole day there, so, yeah. Anything else you guys say?
Yeah. Just to expound on what you said, Tabitha, yes, even when you're writing fantasy, you're creating your own world, but even that's got to have some sort of a structure. It has to have rules, so to say, to make it believable to the reader. And it can be fun falling down a rabbit hole, but you also have to think, okay, is this germane to the plot? Is this what this character would really do? And in the end, that's what first drafts are all about too. You put all your stuff in the first draft, and then as you read it, you go, well, no. That seemed like fun at the time, but this doesn't work, and there it goes. So, yeah, the falling down a rabbit hole is for the first draft. So.
I don't even know if I'd call it the rabbit hole, but I can lose a day or two to research. And I do not do Wikipedia if I can avoid it, because there's that can bite you in the ass because they're not always accurate. In my case, I'm expanding the story Child with Reason into a novel. And again, it's set in the 1690s in Massachusetts. So I need to know, without naming Salem, because I kind of don't want to do that, I need to know the layout of the town. What are 17th century boys and girls' names? I don't want this to be a book about the time that is like the way I learned history. Everybody was white and everybody was like a Puritan. They weren't. But how would a non-white person have carved out a place for themselves and their families at this time? Because I was not going to have them all be like Tituba. They weren't going to be slaves. So if there was a family that was not white, that was different from everybody, why were they of value to the community? How did they make their own space in that community without being treated as the other? And these were supporting characters too, not the main character, but I want that to be authentic. I want it to be true, and I want it to be something that anybody reading it says, yeah, I can see that. And it's elevating, not depressing. I need to know, we know everybody by that time. We're not Puritans. By now we had all of, wherever Europeans were settled in Massachusetts, and that even included Plymouth Plantation. They weren't all people praying to God. They were looking to make a buck. So these were people who had taverns. These were people where, they didn't celebrate Christmas, but they wanted to stop and have a good time sometimes. That type of thing. So for me, it's getting the authentic voice, even though this is a fantasy. It's still got to be true to the history of New England in that sense.
Yes.
I was wondering how or what, like where you draw the line of something is speculatory between something that ends up actually being a belief of a certain culture or religion, probably in like another country. Where do you draw that line to be respectful to that culture, while also saying, hey, kind of doubt it, but hey, I respect that you believe it, kind of thing. I'm sorry if you didn't understand that, I kind of just jabbered, but...
No, that's a good question. So you want to take a stab at that?
Do you have an example that's in your head right now?
Okay, Chinese culture believes that the number 9 means death.
Okay.
Just because my house has the number 9 does not mean I'm going to die in that house, but I understand and respect that that's how they feel, they're not comfortable with it.
Okay.
I could give you another example if you need to, but maybe if that helps.
I mean, if you have an Asian character, they should not be acting in a way that is not Asian. Unless it's way, 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 way in the future. And everybody's in space. And that, and you can make, like Star Trek did. They made the assumption that everybody kind of is from, they had episodes that showed them honoring, which is what is now an ancient culture for them. But at the same time, everybody kind of had the same goals, the same beliefs. And everybody was included in this larger culture. And I'm not even sure how authentic that is, but I think you can get away with that. I think what you do is you just don't have people saying and doing things where somebody comes up to you and says, this Chinese person, this Cherokee person, this Lakota person, I don't care how many centuries into the future you go, they would never, ever, ever act this way. I think you just want to avoid that and care enough. If you can't find it, or if you think your research is faulty, go ask somebody.
The other thing too, though, is if you know that that's, is your story the fact that this house is cursed because the number 9 is on it, and you're creating a story about a haunting and a cursing of the house, that's speculative. Versus you've got a character who has that belief structure, and the people around them are kind of honoring that belief structure, but not really saying the house is haunted necessarily. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If the story is there's a 9 there, and everybody dies in the Amityville Horror, right? Everybody dies at 2:52 a.m. or whatever the heck time it is when she killed, I don't know, whatever it was. Like, that's speculative versus, you know, we believe that if, you know, the family that says you have to throw salt over your shoulder after, or somebody's coming to your house, or you hear a bell ring, and, you know, those are like superstitious, traditional things, you know, knock on wood, we do that, but that's not telling a story that, unless you knock on wood and somebody appears behind me, and now suddenly we have a speculative story, right? So I think that's the line.
This brings to mind a friend of mine in my writers group. By the way, South Shore Scribes, if you're looking for a writers group, message me, and you know, we'll bring you in. It's a really good writers group. Wrote a story, and she went through, had the group kind of scour it, because what it was a George R.R. Martin type person writing this epic fantasy. It's like he's on book 7 now or something like that. But he had fallen into a lot of criticism because of the way he wrote. The heroes were kind of typically white European, and women were written in a way that was not especially flattering. If they were not of a white European type, their culture was represented in a way that was not especially flattering. And now here comes a new generation saying, you can't do that. This is insulting. This is ridiculous. And so he's losing readership, but he's invited to this very secretive conference where everybody's in costume and they're playing characters, but he immediately notices that something's a little different in that there are female characters doing things that they don't do in his books. And there are non-white people dressed as characters who would not be like the ones in his book. Long story short, it's like he's kind of, and by the end of the story, it's like, yeah, you're just going to kind of stay here and you're going to write some new books. And we'll like this, you're going to like to write books the way we think you should be writing them for today's audience. And, you know, he's pretty miserable by the end of the story. It's that type of issue that you're raising. And she wrote, I don't know if she's got it published yet, she wrote a great story about somebody who's getting his comeuppance because it wasn't that he just didn't write for a broader audience. It says he was insulting to that broader audience.
I really have nothing to add. You both covered it so well. So.
Thank you very much. What else we got up there?
Did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Okay.
What else we got? Yes, in the back.
How would a character who experiences a sense of periodic instances of deja vu, with an affirmation that he or she is absolutely certain that he or she has been in this place or experienced something before. And in some religions I've read that they believe that is actually an instance of a previous life. Does that somehow wend its way into speculative, or is that something that's more of a flashback, or does it even count as part of like speculative?
I think it depends on what the story is. You know, is the story that this person is living another life and has a whole set of memories from a different life? That's pretty speculative. I mean, even if we believe it, you know, that we hold the possibility in our minds as human beings that there may be more to our experience than just what we see here, you know, whether you're religious or not, or you're, you know, spiritual or not. Like, that's still something that is, like, pretty speculative if you really took a story there, right, and said, oh, I'm now going back and forth between lives, and I have to somehow reconcile it, or I'm getting information from my dream state to bring forward. That has a speculative element to it, right? So I think, again, it's the story that you're trying to tell, and the elements you're putting in there, are they just like, we've all had that moment of, wait, I think I've been here before. Like, that's okay. That's a human experience we can recognize and be like, oh, it feels like deja vu. That's a common word that we all share. We know what it means. We can throw that in there to a regular story and it doesn't become speculative because we say that. But if we're writing a story and the whole basis of it is that you are, you know, every time you go to sleep, you dream that you are in this other life and you're solving crimes because you're pulling information from that dream state, that feels speculative, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very similar to the previous question about the dead zone and psychic ability. I mean, are people psychic? It could be a good possibility. Deja vu, is it real? Well, maybe it is. I mean, there's no so-called scientific proof to prove it one way or the other, but that doesn't mean anything. As that, it's not speculative fiction, but as Tabitha said, if it's part of the plot, if it's such an integral part of the plot where the character makes things happen and it really moves things along, then it does move into speculative territory, I believe.
Sounds to me like you have a story idea yourself to develop. There actually is, it actually, I mean, it's a very real phenomenon, experiencing deja vu. I just remember as a teacher in psychology classes, I mean, it was like, there were whole sections devoted to that. You may want to check actual research on, studies on deja vu and see what they speculated about it back then when I was in college and what they say about it now, two different things. But there's your, that provides the basis for your jumping off point if you actually do that story idea.
I'm looking here. I got one I'm working on. It's alternate timelines. Now, I'm just trying to figure out here if there's any way to not get myself in too deep, get in trouble. Because like you were saying, you said you make up your rules, but you want to be consistent with your rules and stuff like that. But then, with an alternate timeline sort of story, is there any sort of do's and don'ts or?
Well, I think you would still apply your best world building, rules to anything that's an alternate timeline. I'm just thinking about the Man in the High Castle, right? And that's an alternate. It starts up and World War II, really happened, and really there's a real speculative element to that story beyond the fact that they just changed history and made it so something else happened, and they brought that history forward. There's a real speculative element in that. Right. In the back and forth between the dimension or whatever, the realities. So that's different than just taking a piece of history and rewriting it. Say these people won the war, but we're going to write it sort of set in the world that we know, just with this different timeline. Follow the rules that you're going to make up for your science and your technology, and carry them forward and be consistent. But I think that's a super fun way to, thing to write too. It's pretty cool.
Well, first thing I want to say is that that's a really cool pen you have. That is great. And the alternate timelines, I wasn't quite sure if that was maybe something like the Crichton novel timeline where they go back to the 14th century, or if maybe specific timelines mix.
Yeah, it's a specific timelines mixed is the thing that I'm working on.
Okay. Right. I mean, it's a situation where if you go back to what is considered the past, no matter what you do, step on a butterfly, you're going to change the future. I mean, that's speculative. I mean, what happened during those times is not speculative, but when you mix it like that, and you make this changes happening in both sets of timelines, that's speculative.
Yeah, the whole idea of writing an alternate timeline is speculative, right? It's by nature, but there's that element of otherness that you can bring to it or not, right? So, and then if you do bring the otherness, then follow some good rule building rules around it.
But you also asked, are there any rules or anything you should follow? I do not write science fiction, but multiple timelines is really intriguing. Have you read Einstein's Dreams?
No.
Paul Lightman, I can look up the name. Wonderful book, short book, and the premise is Einstein is working on his theory of relativity and working as a patent clerk. And at night, when he's still working, he falls asleep and he dreams. And every one of his dreams each night is of a possible universe, which includes my favorite one, where everybody knows the day the universe will end. And how people start treating each other better and better. and everybody joins hands at the end singing because everybody's finally equal. But there are a couple in there about multiple timelines.
It's funny you mention that because Einstein is a character in mine. But
you should read this book.
He's just a high school science teacher in mine.
It's one of my all-time favorite books. It's wonderful, and it's optimistic. It really is. When you're really feeling dreadful about the world, this is one that I think makes you feel better. But you know, there is stuff about people who travel through time and people who are aware of multiple timelines, but other people are not, and things like that. I just think if there's, so I would read that, and then I would just say the rule is just consistency. Because supposedly everything you do can set a new era of time skittering off somewhere. And is there an end to those multiple timelines? And you want to talk about a rabbit hole. That's multiple rabbit holes that you got to be careful about getting trapped in.
So I wanted to touch a little more like on world building. I assume that the second you create any world that's outside of Earth, you're already kind of in the speculative genre, the umbrella. But not to go too off course, but I just wanted to ask you guys, because you all have different backgrounds in this, of how much time you like to spend on the world building before really getting into your writing versus if you like to just kind of like get into it and discover it along the way.
Oh, I can talk about that for now. So one of the first things when we do panels that are sci-fi fantasy people and we talk about world building, one of the first things I say is it's so cool to build your worlds, but if you don't have a story running through those worlds, it doesn't matter, right? So I would say build what you need enough to get going, and then in the beginning when I first started writing it, I got stuck there too, maps and gods and histories and this and that, or whatever. And then finally I was just like, okay, I'm going to go down and talk about rabbit hole, right? You just swirl and swirl and swirl. It's really the story. Now I even come at it at a different place. I'm like, I want to tell this story about these characters with this, they're dealing with this trauma or drama or something. And I sort of build the world around that now. And I find that makes for, I think, personally, a more a relatable story that pulls people in versus just all the stuff. The stuff is really, really, really cool, but it isn't why people are going to read your book. They might play it, for a few minutes they might, but then if there's not a good story running through it, it doesn't matter. If you don't have compelling characters that people care about, it doesn't matter. So, build what you need to get started, but I would almost say, what's the story you want to tell and what's the best way to tell that story? And another little nugget of something that I've learned over the years of writing is that there's a difference between your story and plot action. And, that you have this overarching story that you want to tell, but you might be able to get from one part to another 5 different ways. And your job as the storyteller is to do it in the most dramatic, exciting, authentic way. So that makes your story the most compelling. You might not get it the first round. That would be a few edits in. So that's even it's not necessarily about world building, but it's about the storytelling, and I think it's the same thing. You put it in the place where it's going to be the strongest story. It's going to be the most powerful story you can tell, and it has these elements. And sometimes the speculative elements are really important to the story, and sometimes they're not as important. And that, again, depends on your story. But don't get lost in the stuff. It's the fun part, but it also isn't the part that is going to get you to the end, where the character arc and a journey and that sort of thing. So, anybody have anything else to add about world building? We can talk about that forever.
You want to go first?
All right. World building is it's your setting. I mean, it's like a movie or a play. It's what's all around the characters. It is also, as I said before, the structure and the rules. So the world you build, there's importance to it. But I agree with Tabitha 100% that the story and the characters are what really drive the readers to go, wow, this is good. So the world that you build is background, and as long as you don't break the rules that you set for yourself, like say, there's a mountain and there's someone inside the mountain that's like an oracle, and it can tell the future. You know, as long as all of a sudden near the end that oracle comes out as an action hero and starts kicking people left and right, it's like, okay, that doesn't work anymore. This mountain doesn't work anymore. And yeah, I mean, world building does have importance when it comes to fantasy and science fiction. But again, as Tabitha said, the characters and story are the really important things.
I'm reminded of a young woman who came to our writers group, and she wanted to write a story about a city that is populated by vampires. And they weren't necessarily evil people, but you know, she had reams and reams of stuff on the world she was trying to build. It was pretty darn good, and nobody was mean to her, but when she would reach a point where we would say, now what is the story you're going to tell? And she didn't have one. And we tried to really help her, like, you know, like we'd say, you almost started telling a story right here. And you started to tell a story right here. Can you bring these together and make these actually a plot? Because you can world build forever and not get anywhere. And she actually started tearing up. She said, I can't come up with a story. We were trying to tell her, you do have the story. It's there within your world. We could see the elements of it, the threads of it. She had named characters that she wanted to write about. We could see that it was in there. She couldn't take that last leap. And I really think it was just confidence. I think she would have had a kick-ass story. And then she stopped coming to the group, which made me really sad because I think she had something there. But I think she got stuck in this. It wasn't just a rabbit hole, it was a vortex rabbit hole. It's like, my world. No, now start telling the story. This is wonderful what you have. Start telling the story. Somebody somewhere told her story ideas were stupid, and I don't understand that. I hope wherever she is, she actually sat down and started getting that, you know, that story on paper and discovered the story. So I personally believe in having the story first. My world building is world within the world. You know, I don't do stuff on other planets. I don't do things in other dimensions. So I'm expanding my short story, Child of Reason, into a novel. He is a supernatural creature with supernatural parents, but he has to somehow function in the world of real people. And because we know the history, you know, we have a history of that part of Massachusetts where there was a witch hysteria, and you can put somebody like this character in there, and he doesn't mean to, but he causes the witch hysteria. But it also has to be something where most people don't see what he does. It's done in secret, it's done in shadow, and those who do discover it soon end up dead because he's trying to protect himself. You know, so it's world within the world. It has to be consistent with the history. It has to be consistent with what ordinary people believed at the time and thought was happening at the time. But there's a fantastical element that only a handful of people get to know.
The story within the world. Often, if I get stuck, what I get stuck on is the plot action or something, and I'll back myself up and I'll say, okay, what does this character want? I just had this issue, and it was like an aha moment where I say, they could just go in and kill this evil bad guy. They could do it. They're tough enough. They're badass enough. They're whatever. But there's got to be some reason, because I can't. It'll be over too quickly. So what is the power that this evil prince has that stops them in their tracks? And world building came out of that. Magic came out of that. I was like, aha. What if his magic is X, Y, Z? Now I have to carry that all the way through, but it worked. And I was like, aha. So I started with what do my characters want? What's stopping them? The typical questions, right? What's stopping them from getting it, and then how do we overcome that? And so that there was my plot right there, and my story in the world that I was building. So you kind of come back to that. What do your characters want? What's stopping them, and how do they overcome it? And you can use magic, you can use science, you can use this world around you, and that's where you then have to think consistently, and you don't use it as an excuse. You don't use it to write yourself out of a plot tangle, right? People know that it's an excuse, like add a new power. No, that's just that's a cop out essentially. But sometimes the magic or the tech or the whatever in the world really comes out of the story and what the characters need.
Some of our very old tropes, story tropes, I think, may have grown from that problem of trying to tell a story. For example, the separable soul. There's an awful lot of stories, not just fairy tales. You want to read some seriously kick-ass stories of Voyages of Sinbad if you've never read the original ones. Forget how women are treated and all that other stuff. That was the society at the time. But the soul that can be hidden in an egg, and it's always the evil person who does that, and its most recent incarnation, of course, was in the Harry Potter novels, So some of your old tropes are still new. The problem you just described is, it's not, it's how is evil accomplished and how is it protected so that now the hero, and every culture has the hero tales, the hero can't just throw a spear or fire an arrow. There are much more difficult things that he or she has to accomplish, before evil is vanquished.
When you're world building along the way, like you just mentioned, examining the want and creating magic, like how do you keep track of all of your rules and everything that you've done? I mean, like
very messy notebook.
Okay. Because that's
so it's do this, and they look like this, and a good copy editor.
Okay. That's where I am, and I wondered if there was some other function.
Now, one of my friends is a scrivener, and she loves the note card features and putting the scenes in different things. I am just straight up, I have 6 million, when I'm drafting, I have notebooks everywhere, I have them on my phone, I have them and I just, when the thoughts come, I scribble them out. And it's like juggling, I had somebody else gave this analogy, it's not mine, but it's perfect, and I was thinking about it, like taking the laundry out of the dryer in your hands, and the socks are falling out, and you're trying to pick it up, and you're trying to juggle this story to the kitchen table so you can put it into some order. That's sort of how I feel when I'm drafting and when things are being created, but I catch it, because I have enough, like this notebook here, and that thing here. Oh, when I wake up at my bed, there's a notebook by the bedside table. I have no good way of doing that, but I do it. Just the old school, scribble it in a messy notebook way. But I don't know if anybody has a better, more logical.
No, that works.
So if that's your way and you're feeling, I don't know, substandard, no, you're not. It's fine. We all do it.
Although what I would say is, I write a synopsis of each chapter after I finish it with page numbers so I can find it again. I don't even remember character names. It takes me 2 years to write a novel, and I'm halfway through the book, and suddenly, it's like, who's Charlotte? Oh, yeah, it's actually Celia. It's like, I changed the name just out of the blue.
Yeah.
I do Google Docs, so I think that sounds good.
Yeah, there's not one tried and true way, but I do. By the time I got to book 3 in this one, I needed to loop back to a character, and I couldn't remember their name. I'm like, oh god. So I kept looking up words in the document that were around it, like I knew something was happening around it. I'm like, destruction. I'm like, nope, he's not there. Or put another word in. Finally, I found him, and I was like, oh, if I had done that, if I'd indexed my numbers, that would have been great. Chapter this is where they live. So yeah, great question.
I just wanted to add something. When I'm writing at night, I used to use a pen, and the pen runs out of ink. And I'm doing it in the dark because I didn't know how to write. I use this now at night. I use this at night now.
Invisible ink.
Yeah.
That's why I use a pencil.
And then I'm looking at the indentation.
Trying to do a rubbing, you're free from it. I knew it last night.
Oh my god.
Yeah, and you think you're going to remember, but you don't.
You never remember.
No, you think, if it's important enough, it'll come back. No,
3 times after using a pen and not having it work, I went to this.
There you go. Good point. All right, yes.
So obviously when we're all writing, we get really passionate about ideas and it's really hard to let go of those ideas. So my question is, like, when you're writing speculative fiction, how do you let go of those elements that you were so excited about when you started your story to make the story work and still stay passionate about the story itself when you're losing that really exciting element that you
I know, it's so hard when you have to kill your darlings, right? That's really, you know, when people say that expression, I've written many blog posts about this. It doesn't mean you have to kill off a main character. Sometimes you do. It means you have to kill those elements of the story that don't serve the story when you're coming to your later drafts, right? And they're really hard. I cut them out. I actually stick them in another file, thinking that maybe they have a home somewhere, it has a life somewhere, and usually they don't. They're usually gone forever, but it makes me make the transition okay. Like I pull it out of there, I stick it in there. It's not lost or dead. It's just living in another space. It will have its time. Even if it doesn't, it's my psychological telling myself. Time, you know, between when you finish and get it all out there and you're so excited about it, you know you have to do the work of cutting, take a step back, drink a bottle of wine, I don't know, write something else, right? And then come back to it. It gets easier if you put a little distance because then you're approaching it fresh and then you can say, yeah, that doesn't belong there anymore. And it will be a better story if it's gone, you know. And there have been little tidbits that I have used later on. There's been something, a nugget there that I have been able to use as a seed for something else, so it's not lost. Those are just psychological tricks because it's not fun to lose pieces of writing or ideas that were so inspiring. And they just don't work for that story. But so I have my tricks. Those are two of them.
I think though, if you're being honest with yourself, you'll realize that, okay, this is on its way to becoming a 600-page manuscript. It's too unwieldy. Something's got to go. And then if you sit down and actually start reading through it, you realize that the idea you had is great, but it's making the whole tedious, you know, and that's when you find you can say goodbye. And you can pull it out.
And sometimes you have too many characters,
yeah.
right? Like, and you love them all, but there's too many to keep track of. So you have to consolidate and then into, you know, and pare them down a little bit. And that actually makes the story better reading, better for your readers. Because one thing you don't want is confusion. You know, suspense is great, page-turning moments are great, but confusion makes people upset. It makes them put down the book. So if you've got too much happening, and people are giving you the feedback that I'm confused by all the various different things you have, it's time to consolidate it into something more manageable, I would say.
And it's also the time where you're really thankful if you have an honest beta reader, someone who will look at it with a much more objective eye than you have and say, you know, this part here does not work. And you're, but, no, it doesn't work. And then you look at it with a more objective eye and you realize, yeah, that person was right, that doesn't work. So I think it was Stephen King, in one of his nonfiction writing books, that said, when you do the first draft, it's with the door closed, but when you do the next draft, it's with the door open. That's what that's all about, just getting another set of eyes on there. And even yourself, put it away for a while and say, okay, yeah, that seemed like a good idea at the time, but that's not really good for the rest of the book, so it's going to go.
It's this thing I was alluding to earlier, that the story is still there, but you can tell the story with different plot mechanism, plot action, different ways to achieve A to Z, right? And you want to pick the one that's the strongest and the most powerful storytelling, and that might require pairing around it. So, and do you guys have beta readers? Okay, who's a writer in the room? Probably most of you, right? You're mostly writers. So I have a quick and dirty list for what you can invite your beta readers to give you feedback about. The first thing I ask my beta readers, because you know, you send it out to 50 people, and some of them say, it was the best thing I ever wrote, that's not helpful. Or I didn't really like, that's not helpful. Or it's Mom, and she's like, I love everything. And they say, that's not really helpful. So how do you get helpful feedback? And I'll just give you my quick and dirty list, because this is, it really helped me. One, are they oriented quickly into what kind of story you're telling, especially if it's speculative? They need to know within the first chapter that they're in a fantasy, that they're in a, you know, a sci-fi. You orient them quickly to where they are. So do they know that? Two, are there places where they turn the page and they're bored to tears? Those are places where your pacing is off, you're adding too much, you're you're info dumping. So you want those things. 3, ask them how they're responding to your characters. Don't tell them how they should respond. Ask them how they're responding, because it may not be how you want them to. And that's a sign that you did something missing, or you didn't quite get that character. Are they confused anywhere? And that's another one. And that's usually where you'll get your, I've got too much going on and I have to pare it down. Are they confused? And then, was the ending satisfying? Now, was it a happy ending? Not every book has to have a happy ending, but did it suit the story, and were they satisfied when they got to the end? And if you get feedback on those 5 points from people, it'll help you to tone in your story into something a little bit more, if it's unwieldy, something a little bit more ready for the next step. But it won't happen in one draft, so don't worry. Yes?
Just wondering, going back to something you were saying about too many characters and too much going on and stuff like this. Case in point, though, The Lord of the Rings. I mean, there was, what, 20 main characters spread out all over the place?
George R. R. Martin did it with the Game of Thrones. It wasn't 20, but it was like a lot of story arcs happening at the same time.
You know,
it can be done well. It's just, it's a lot, to manage. And to me, now this is an unpopular opinion, but I didn't like reading his book. I didn't like reading George R. R. Martin's books. I liked watching them on the screen because I could get invested in each episode, and I would be pulled in, and then there was time in between if I wasn't binging. There was time in between to let go of that group and get to the next one, and then then I could appreciate by the end how it all wove together, except for the very end, of course. But but I didn't enjoy the reading experience of that because it was too disjointed for me. I was just investing in something, and then I got pulled out and pulled back in. He did it really well. I still didn't like it. So that's it can be done well. It's just, and some of it's preference, and we don't all like the same things, we don't all read the same things, we don't all write the same way. It doesn't mean it's not good writing. Just, so if you're keeping track, and it really is, following the story arcs, and that they're weaving together somehow, and the magic works, and it transverses all the lands or whatever, it can be done really, really well, but it wasn't enjoyable for me. It was too much for me. So, yeah, just an opinion. Anybody else have a question? I think we're getting near the end, so we are at the end. But I'll take one more.
Piggybacking off what the girl had said earlier about putting too much in everything.
Yeah.
If there is something you need to take out of a chapter or the plot itself, would you recommend maybe sticking that in a little different area for another time because maybe it could be useful again? Or
I do. I always save it. I save stuff. Because sometimes I have a file folder that I actually call It's Not Your Turn Yet. And anything that, I really do. It's a file on my computer, and I pull things out. Because oftentimes, too, when you're writing and you're in the creative space, that's when the new ideas come. But if you stop every time a new idea comes, you'll never finish the first one. So if they have merit, like an idea, and it's just not quite fitting for this thing, I do put it in. I'll take a little time, and I'll give it a little sketch, and I'll put it in that file folder. And sometimes I pick it back up, and sometimes I don't. But at least psychologically, I don't feel like I've wasted thinking space, or output. So.
Yeah, so I've done it, especially with some of these short stories. I feel like I have a good idea here, but then I realize it's not such a good idea for that story. But as Tabitha said, it's too good to waste. Then I'll incorporate it in a short story, usually.
And it's not a terrible thing. I mean, if you get a book published and the short story is published, it's something you can guide readers to. If they've read your book, they might recognize a character or a setting or something, the world you built in the short story itself. So now you've got people looking at you as, oh, is she or she going to write more about this particular world or this particular character?
Well, we are at time. Did anybody have a last pressing question? Because the other groups kind of come in here shortly. But if not, I will say thank you so much. If you want to come talk more to us, we'll be at our table somewhere out in the amorphous landscape out there. Thank you.